Since the start of the Bahraini revolution just 2 months ago, nearly 30 people have been killed by the security forces. So why has Britain, a close ally of the country, remained silent about human rights abuses in Bahrain?
Have you passed this on to the government?
This might made by your country.
We don't want to do anything that will upset the rulers.
I spent 10 days working undercover in Bahrain, filming the violent crackdown on dissent the Bahraini government doesn't want the world to see. From arbitrary arrests to the use of live fire against unarmed civilians, the state's repression now targets Bahrain's entire Shia population. In the besieged village of Bani Jamra, human rights activist Nabil Rajab explains the situation.
Well, as you see now, the situation is critical, and as the tank is everywhere in the street, all the villages are sieged by the GCC forces, and people still protesting, and we have one guy died yesterday, and we have tens of people injured. I mean, it's sad that we can't take them to any hospital, because the only hospital that we have has been taken by the government. And all the injured people, we've been treating them at home and with volunteer doctors and nurses.
I was lucky. Just days after this interview, armed police stormed into Nabil Rajab's house and arrested a group of American journalists just for speaking to him. Since the Saudi army entered Bahrain, the country's Shia majority has been subjected to a reign of terror.
Police is all around us 24 hours, indeed, because we're asking for legitimate demands. One of the demands is that we're asking for freedom. We ask for an elected government. We want our freedom. That's what we want. And unfortunately, the government doesn't understand us, and they try attacking us with high live ammunition, with tear gas, day and night.
In the village of Sar, I attended the funeral of a 15-year-old boy, Syed Ahmed Shams, who was shot in the face by police while playing football with his friends.
كنا قاعدين مجموعة قاعدين نلعب ومرة واحدة طلع علينا واحد من رجال الأمن من لفة وشافنا وقام يطلق علينا وجو وياه اثنين متلثمين وقاموا يطلقون واحنا على طريقنا كنا بنهرب وشافوا قاموا يطلقوا علينا كذي وصادت الشهيد في راسه وغم عليه طاح صوبه مسيل دموع طاح صوبه وقام يستنشق من الغاز وطاح ما قدر يتنفس.
Thousands gathered to mourn Bahrain's latest martyr and to call for the downfall of the Al Khalifa dynasty. But back in London, you'd be forgiven for knowing nothing about Syed's death, or about the other innocent civilians killed by the Bahraini regime. Britain ruled Bahrain for over 200 years and still retains great influence there, yet the Foreign Office didn't condemn the Bahraini government's violence, and the BBC didn't report it. Now, I want to find out why the atrocities in Bahrain are being ignored here in the UK.
Now, the Foreign Office won't speak to us, so I've come here to Chatham House, Britain's foremost foreign policy think tank, to discover what the British government really thinks about Bahrain.
Jane Kininmod is a senior research fellow at Chatham House and an expert on Bahrain.
Now, I'd like to show you some footage I filmed in Bahrain. That's the funeral of a 15-year-old boy called Syed Ahmed Shams. Yeah, he was shot in the face by a policeman at close range while playing football with his friends. Now, the people at this funeral told me that the British government is very keen to protest at lethal use of force against protesters in some countries, in Syria, for example. But so far, the British government has said nothing about this incident or others like it.
Of course, there's a lot of different accounts coming out, and I think I can't remember what the officials had to say in this particular instance, but they are essentially accusing opposition groups of making a lot of things up. You'll probably have seen the head of the Bahrain Centre for Human Rights has been summoned for questioning for allegedly fabricating photos and things like this. I don't know if you have a chance to interview Foreign Office officials, but I imagine that they would say that there's still doubts about what has actually happened.
No, the Foreign Office won't speak to us. They haven't responded to our requests for interviews so far. Actually, the Bahraini government said this boy just fell over and broke his neck. Now, I saw his body, I saw a bullet wound to his face. Just what is the nature of the relationship between the UK and Bahrain?
Well, it's always been a very close relationship. Britain was the imperial power in Bahrain in a protectorate relationship since the 19th century. Bahrain only became independent from the UK in 1971, and there have continued to be very close political ties, business ties, cultural ties as well.
Does the UK still retain any political influence in Bahrain?
I think it certainly does. I mean, Britain and America are the key foreign allies outside the Gulf countries. I don't think that Britain and America have been driving forces behind the recent crackdown in Bahrain, which I think has been much more heavily influenced by Saudi Arabia. But I think Britain certainly is still a very important voice in Bahrain.
This was the son of a 71-year-old man who was asphyxiated by tear gas in his own home.
I read about him also.
USA supporting our government to kill us. What is this? This to protect citizens or to protect our government? See, this made by USA. USA. What you say, Mr. Obama? What you say about this one?
Do you think the British government's been too slow or too wary of criticising these acts?
I think already last year, Bahrain had opted to take a much more hardline approach towards its opposition. I mean, looking from about the end of August last year. And I do think there should have been more said earlier, actually, before it escalated to this level. I think Bahrain carried out some, in the Gulf context, significant political reforms about 10 years ago, and Britain and America praised it highly for those reforms. But I think a problem was that those reforms then stalled, began to reverse, and actually Bahrain's foreign allies didn't do very much to point that out. And I think it would have been helpful to say more earlier on. There is always a debate about to what extent things are said behind closed doors and so on. And I think that would probably be an argument people would make, that there were things being said in private and so on, but clearly didn't have a very significant effect.
It's becoming clear that the British establishment has insulated itself from the brutal consequences of its support for the Bahraini regime. Thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf, in a peaceful English village, I met Conservative MP Ian Liddell-Granger, a member of the British Parliament's UK Bahrain Group, a body traditionally supportive of the Bahraini government.
Do you think the Foreign Office is doing enough?
I think they are, because the situation is extremely fluid. It's very difficult sometimes, and we're seeing this in Libya especially, where both sides were unsure who's doing what. And that quite often happens because these situations tend to start off very small and then grow like a snowball, for want of a better word. And I think what has happened here is that there is a lot of confusion. And I think the Foreign Office has been making it very clear. They want to know what's happening, why it's happening, and to try and understand not only the government side, but also what the people are complaining and protesting about. Because Bahrain, we've had a very long history of friendship with Bahrain and the people of Bahrain.
This is the funeral of a 15-year-old boy who was shot in the face by the police while playing football. His family asked me to show this to the government in Britain. They want Britain to intervene in the same way Britain has in Libya.
Have you passed this on to the government?
I'm trying to pass this on to the Foreign Office. Do you expect any actual practical outcome if I do?
Well, I would like to think we can say to the Bahrainis there should be a full inquiry, as we're doing when one of our own people was pushed at the G20, and we're having an inquiry into that. And it's the same principle, that there must be an inquiry into this. That poor family, it's absolutely distraught by what's happened, and it seemed to be a younger brother there who was in the first part of the film, and you can understand the anguish and the worry, and it was the same in this country. And I would urge you to send it to the Foreign Office, and can assure you that if you can't get to the Foreign Office, if you send me a copy, my office a copy, I will send it to the Foreign Office.
I definitely will do that. If I can show you a couple of more things.
Yeah, please do.
Every few hundred metres in Bahrain, there are military checkpoints, police checkpoints, and people are essentially dragged out of the cars randomly and beaten at the side of the road and taken into police custody. I saw that. You see the policeman's kicking a hooded suspect.
Well, this is totally unacceptable.
You see the policeman punching a hooded suspect there.
What's happened there?
That's another suspect they've been
I
kicking.
see. Oh, it's a human. Good
yes,
morning.
I saw this.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to pass those photographs on as well, without any problems at all.
I can show you this. That's a bullet hole in a lamppost where the police had fired live rounds into a group of peaceful protesters.
I would urge you to send them to start with as a journalist, just ask for comment as a journalist, and you're accredited. But if you would like me to send them as well, then I'm more than happy to send them. And you can email me on the email you've got. I'm more than happy to send those up.
Why has the reaction of the British government been so different to essentially the abuse of the civilian population in Libya on the one hand and Bahrain on the other?
That's a very good question indeed. And there's, as you're well aware, I'm a Conservative MP as well as being a part of the All-Parliamentary Group. And we've had major conversations with David Cameron, the Prime Minister, over this, and said, look, what happens when other countries, and we have situations in Syria, in Qatar, in Aden, Yemen, Eritrea, and we've actually got British nationals out there. And we said, look, what is the difference? And it's a very good question, and I don't think we've had it adequately answered in Parliament or to the British people. And I think you can't differentiate between one person and another who's suffering the same thing. So I do think that the government needs to address this really urgently, but I think you'll find that that is a fairly common theme throughout the House.
But surely the government knows, I mean...
Oh, I don't think... I think this is why it's important you must get these films to the government, and I really would urge you to please send them to the Foreign Secretary and to the Secretary of State for International Development.
Yeah.
And I'm more than happy to help you in that.
Now, we've asked the Foreign Office for an interview and they've said they're too busy. We've given them a long list of questions about Bahrain and we haven't heard a response. For the British government, it seems, Bahrain just isn't an issue.